Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I'm sharing with you the books and resources I'm using to put together our Waldorf Main Lesson Block for chemistry. Now I do have a separate video that showcases all of the resources I have that you could use to put together a chemistry unit study. I have a variety of books, I have some demonstrations and kits that you could use in order to do your experiments. But for today's video, I'm sharing with you a shorter list of resources, very specifically geared towards the ones that you could use to put together your Waldorf Main Lesson Block. Now, I do have a couple of Waldorf resources, and then I have a couple of other things that I think help me personally when I'm putting together and doing our main lesson blocks. And then I have some of the materials that you might need in order to do your demonstrations and experiments. So I want to start off by sharing with you the Chemistry Main Lesson Book by Live Education. This one is not sold individually. It is sold as part of the entire 8th grade curriculum. So if you were looking for just the single Chemistry Main Lesson Block, I do have something for you if you want to just explore the Waldorf pedagogy and Waldorf Main Lesson Block just for chemistry. But first I want to share with you the main lesson book that comes with several other main lesson books for the 8th grade year. And the reason why I'm sharing this with you first is that when you're buying it as a complete curriculum, you're going to have other main lesson blocks that coordinate with one another. So you're not doing chemistry in isolation. You're doing chemistry that's going to coordinate with the other main lesson blocks for that year. When it comes to chemistry and anatomy, for instance, it's suggested that you do your chemistry block before you do your anatomy block. So that's what's nice about having your complete curriculum, is that you're going to get those kinds of insights that you might not get if you're just buying a chemistry resource. The chemistry main lesson block has the resources that the teacher will use in order to present the lessons. This isn't necessarily used for the student. The student doesn't have access to this book. This is for the parent or the teacher to gather the resources together in order to do the lesson. And then it has some illustrations, which is wonderful, so that you can include those in your main lesson book, or you can use them as chalk drawings. And then it has a lot of insight on how to actually put together the lessons, topic ideas, lesson activities, lesson demonstrations. And so it's quite robust in that sense. The thing is that if you haven't used this type of curriculum before, you might be surprised at how much work you need to put into it in order to deliver these lessons. It is not an open and go curriculum. It is not a scripted curriculum. So you do need to prepare yourself, reading through the lessons ahead of time. And with this particular main lesson block, and with most of the science main lesson blocks, you do need to collect the materials that you're going to need in order to do the demonstrations. And while I rarely had time to practice the demonstrations before we did them, it is advised that you do practice your demonstrations and your experiments before you do them, so that you can work through them and make sure that you can present them well. Because part of the lesson is in the presentation, not just in the lesson book work, but when you're doing your demonstrations. And I use demonstrations and experiments interchangeably, but actually you should be using the word, and I should be using the word demonstration, because that's what they are primarily. They're not so much experiments as much as they are demonstrations and things that the children or the students are experiencing. So when it comes to putting together these lessons, you will need some additional prep time that you might not have needed as much with some of the other lessons, like history, for instance. Reading the passages ahead of time and then presenting the lesson is a lot easier than collecting the materials that you need in order to do the demonstrations. So this main lesson block is going to have the resources that you need, it's going to list out the resources that you're going to need. And what I really love about that is that, for instance, some of the very first topics are on combustion and burning, and it tells you specifically you need a paraffin wax candle, not a beeswax candle. And if you have been working in the Waldorf curriculum for years, you will be very familiar with beeswax candles. You probably have many of them, but you're actually going to need a paraffin wax candle. And a few years ago when we did this chemistry block for the first time, which we didn't actually finish, I made some paraffin wax candles so that we would have them ready when we did our lessons. Something else you're going to notice is that the topics that are covered are, I feel, different than the ones that you would have in a typical chemistry curriculum. So you're going to start with combustion, then you're going to, section 2 is salt forming process, and then section 3 is solutions, solvents, and catalysts. And I think that with a lot of chemistry curricula, you're going to find the introduction of the periodic table, you're going to identify the parts of chemistry, and you'll definitely have solutions, solvents, and catalysts. You'll have, the chemical reactions, the substances, but you're not starting necessarily with combustion. So with the Waldorf approach, you're going to be starting with something that's observable for the students. So we can talk about molecules and atoms and elements, but those are not observed in a way that for the student it's going to be relatable. But combustion is all around us. Especially if you have a gas stove, for instance, or you're cooking, or you're burning wood, or you're burning a candle, the concept of combustion is around us a lot more presently than something that's unseen. And though we could see, say, a collection of H2O in the water that we drink, we're not seeing that individually. So this is going to be a curriculum that you can purchase with the other main lesson blocks from Live Education for grade 8. If you do not want to buy an entire curriculum, you might consider Chemistry the Waldorf Way. This is for grades 7 and 8. Now, we have used Physics the Waldorf Way primarily for grade 6, but I do have it for grades 6, 7, and 8. You can also buy it as a collection in one book. And I love the presentation of this book. I love this book, and we haven't used it yet. And I especially love the physics one because we have used that one, and I found that the demonstrations were very easily understood. They were well written. The equipment and the materials are off to the side, so you can make quick work of figuring out what you need in order to present the lessons. And at the beginning of the book, it goes through explaining the Waldorf perspective on how to teach chemistry, what's going on with the student in middle school. And what I liked about it too, and we haven't done demonstrations, as I should say, with this book yet. And so I encourage you to check out the review video at the end of this unit, and you can find that video at the end of the playlist, and you can find the playlist for all of our chemistry related videos in the description box below. You can also head to my website at pepperandpine.com to find the blog post that accompanies this video that shares all of the resources as well as links to these resources and the videos that we have done for this unit, and you can find the link to the blog post in the description box below. So what I like about this book also, especially, is that it explains what's going on with your middle school student, and it shares the difference between the main lesson block, like the time period to do your main lesson, versus a main lesson that has a lab associated to it. So I want to find that for you so that you can see the difference in the schedule. Now, if you've never done a main lesson before, you might be surprised to find that the duration of a main lesson can be anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 hours. And for our main lessons, it's very easy for our main lessons to take up to 2, even 3 hours. But it's broken up into several different parts. And often, at least in our homeschool setting, these different parts of our lesson aren't always done within that 2.5 hour block. Sometimes we're breaking this up and doing some parts earlier in the day and other parts later in the day. And that's not ideal necessarily, and that's certainly not how you will see it in a Waldorf school setting, where they usually block off about 2 hours for the main lesson. However, there can be maybe an hour later in the day in order to do extra work that wasn't completed during the main lesson. So there can be some opportunities to break that up. But basically in a main lesson, the way that they have it set up here is that you begin with your warm-up exercises. So that's like, say, 15 to 20 minutes. I call them opening activities. Then you have your review work, which could take up to 20 minutes or longer. You have your work time, which is an hour or so. And I'm glad that the author was, I guess, accurate in how long lesson work actually takes. This would be the work that you are putting into your main lesson book, and then demonstration and recapitulation. So the demonstration for the lab, and here it shows where there is a lab activity adjust as follows. And so you could have your work time be a little bit different. But when you're doing the demonstration for an actual main lesson would be the new lesson. This is for lab work. So when you have a lab, the lab will be the last thing you do. You're doing all of your work ahead of time. So I'll explain how I do my main lessons and the terminology that I use. I begin with an opening activity typically, and here they have warm-up exercises. So an opening activity for me might be a game like this, for instance, The Wonders of Science. And this is a card game by Professor Noggins. It comes with some illustrated pictures, although they are now updated, and many of the newer versions have photography as the cover, and some of them do still have some illustrations, but they have all been updated. Then you have questions on the back. You have some easy questions and some hard questions. And there are several cards. It also comes with a dice. We rarely use the dice. We usually just divide up the card deck, maybe 5 cards per person, sometimes a little bit more. We have rarely, if ever, done the whole deck in one sitting. So when we're doing this, we'll each take 5 cards, and these are the questions that we ask our partner. And if they get the question correct, they get to keep the card, and at the end you can just tally up and see who got the most cards. What I like about this is that it's usually a very quick way to bring the students into this learning space. It's usually enjoyable. This is trivia based, so if you haven't had enough exposure to the content, you will have a harder time answering the questions, but you might find that it's easier as you progress through your main lesson block or your unit study. And by the end of it, especially if you're playing this often, you will go through so many questions that you will have to move into the harder questions, or you'll end up having repeat questions. There may be other games that are less trivia based when it comes to the sciences, but mostly I found that this game and all of the other ones in the series work really well for our opening activities. You could also bring in some mental math, which we do on a regular basis. You could do some active math where you're using a beanbag and tossing it back and forth. But I found that as my students got closer to middle school and beyond, some of those more physical or active opening activities weren't as engaging as they used to be when the children were younger. Something else that I like to include in our opening activities, possibly a picture book or a biography or something that we can sort of come together and read. With middle school students, I find that doing a picture book just with a middle school student doesn't work as well as doing a picture book when there are middle school students and younger students. And this is for the homeschool environment. If you were doing this in a school setting, I would recommend that you read if you want to do a biography, read the biography ahead of time and then just present it as part of your opening activity rather than having a picture book and reading it aloud. I tend to like to include picture books because for the majority of our homeschooling, so we've been homeschooling for more than 20 years, we always had a toddler or a preschooler or a kindergartner or a young elementary student working alongside our older students. And so having some picture books meant that we were getting the content, which I find really valuable in picture books, and we're getting the picture book vibe. And honestly, our youngest children often didn't even want to look at the pictures. They would listen to the story and they would be playing with their games. So a lot of times I was reading the picture books aloud, but looking at the pictures myself. So when we're including picture books, you might choose a topic that is coordinating with the topic that you're doing, or you might choose a picture book that has a topic of something that you've previously done so that it's a little bit of a review, or you might choose a topic that is upcoming as an inspiration or motivation for the upcoming unit. So this book is going to have so many stories. It has 50 fearless pioneers who changed the world. So that's enough for 50 lessons if you're just doing one story a day. So I find this book to be a really valuable resource for part of our opening activities. Okay, once you're completed with your opening activities, and for us, I think it's pretty accurate that it takes about 15 to 20 minutes. You might choose to also include some daily work as part of your opening activities. I tend to do that separately. Our daily work tends to be a few worksheets in math and language arts. Sometimes I'll include some other subjects, but primarily it's math and language arts. It's usually a grade or two below the grade that my students are at, and this tends to be review work. It also tends to be a bit of busy work as well, so that I can focus on preparing lessons or just have a breather before we start our main lesson. And those are packets that I put together ahead of time, either a week ahead, or sometimes I've prepared them for the entire year before the school year starts. They're either in a binder or they are just stapled together. And then the students can just do 1 or 2 pages, or in the case of my middle schooler, her daily work is actually quite robust with up to 10 pages sometimes, and taking up to an hour on some days. But it's better if it takes 30 minutes or less at middle school and 15 minutes or less for middle elementary, and maybe only 5 to 10 minutes if your students are just starting out with school. And oftentimes by that age, if they're just starting out, there really isn't a worksheet they can do that's a couple of years younger, and their time would be better served in free play rather than in worksheet work. And again, this is not something you'll typically find in a Waldorf setting. I use it primarily for proficiency work and eventually mastery work, so they can master especially those math concepts, and a little bit for busy work. Okay, so once that warm up or opening activity or daily work is done, then we're going to work on review. And this is one area that I tend to overlook and put that time towards our main lesson book work. But review is so important, because when you've done a demonstration or you've presented a lesson, that review work allows the student to bring that information back up. It was delivered, the child slept on it, because when you're reviewing the previous day's work. So the child has slept, the child has processed the work processed the information, and now we want to bring that back up to the surface and talk about it. And I'm not usually asking questions during this time and testing whether the child remembers. I'm really just asking for, almost in a sense, an oral narration of what we previously did in our lesson. And this allows the child to remember the lesson. And what I'm sometimes looking for is a chronological remembering of the lesson. This isn't necessarily important, but I'm curious to see if they're remembering it chronologically, or if they're remembering it in bits and pieces. And then when they're remembering it in bits and pieces, then you can kind of see either the thing that stuck with them the most, or the thing that they were able to bring back from their memory the fastest. It's just a curiosity that you might start to see some patterns. Then we want to do our work time, and this is generally the part of the lesson that takes the longest. It's not the most enjoyable part of the lesson. This usually includes a written portion to the lesson and an illustration. And at the middle school age, typically the illustrations, well, for science, they're actually still going to be quite robust, but the illustrations can, in other subjects, start to be a little bit more minimal, and it's replaced with a lot more writing. And you might find that you have smaller main lesson books, but this particular book recommends that you still use a large format main lesson book, even up to 11 to 14 inches. We typically use 9.5 by 12 inches, which is used maybe in like second, third, fourth grade. And I'm still using them in middle school, but I'm happy to see another teacher advise that you use a larger format main lesson book for this particular lesson. So using a larger format allows enough space for your illustration because you are going to be illustrating your demonstration. And then on the adjoining page, you have enough room to write the notes related to that. So your work time is when you're putting all of that work into your main lesson book. Then you have the demonstration. So you're ending the lesson, the entire lesson, with one of the shorter aspects of the lesson, and that's the demonstration part. If you're doing a lesson that does not include a demonstration, then that would be the new learning for the day. And it's actually a really nice way to end the lesson after the student has done so much work. It's now time to, in a sense, sit back and take in the new learning, which typically is a lot easier than doing the actual active work of the review or the main lesson work. So for this book, I found that the layout of it makes it so easy for someone, even if you've not done chemistry or you haven't done the sciences, this book makes it so easy for you to be successful in your demonstrations. So it's going to do a layout that is reminiscent of a lot of scientific books where you have your procedure, you have your equipment and your materials, you have your safety, which is really important. Please don't overlook that, even though you might feel like you're just working in your home or your kitchen. Please don't overlook the safety. Do have your safety goggles. We are going to be working with chemicals that you do need to be mindful of. Store correctly, wear the gloves, use the appropriate amount. Lye was called for one of the demonstrations. We also have our denatured alcohol as our fuel, and we have our version of a Bunsen burner, and then the whole contraption that comes with it. Actually, they were all sold separately, but this is a stand, and then you can buy the attachments separately depending on what you are using it for, whether you're adding in your, sorry, this is not in the best position here. Whether you have your beakers in like this, and then you can have your heating element below. This may be a little bit hard to see. And then you also have the ring as well. And there are other attachments that you can buy for this stand. And you can find the links to all of the materials that we used on the blog post that accompanies this video. I believe this one was from Ward's Science, but there are plenty of vendors that sell these materials. The book definitely recommends that you get some beakers. This one's 250 mils. This one's also 250 mils, but the beaker is a little bit easier for most of the demonstrations. You can also have this kind that has the attachment. I think for one of the projects we did for our physics, we needed a candy thermometer, and that might be why we had the attachment. And so, oh, and one other thing that we got specifically, I had a couple, but I couldn't find them, and I could only find a large quantity of pipettes, but we also have our pipettes. And so these are some of the basic materials that you might use, or might need rather. One other thing that I got when we were doing our chemistry unit the first time was a stand for our beakers. And this one looks like this. And then you can dry your beakers on these stands right here. And then we also have our polymer candles, which I put here, but that's not really where they're supposed to go. And then I do have these as well, but I cannot remember what project they are necessary for. I did also get 2 new items for this main lesson block based on the book Chemistry the Waldorf Way, and I do not remember which demonstrations they're for, but we have these spoons which have a special name, and I cannot remember the name for them. So we have these 2. We also still have our candy thermometer, and the reason why I had a candy thermometer is I needed something that had, I believe that was digital and had a high temperature reading that could tolerate high temperatures. And then we also have, for another demonstration, we have our zinc and copper. It comes really beautifully packaged. And then the copper, this one has the film on it. So that's what it looks like. And this is for one of the demonstrations. And then we have the zinc as well. So those are some of the materials that I looked ahead and purchased, but there definitely will be other things as I work through the book that I'll probably need to get. The Waldorf curriculum also has a list at the beginning of the book, a few items that you may need, and glass tubing, maybe that's why I got this, is because it was recommended here. Okay, one moment. Okay, and then the candy thermometer or a chemical thermometer, and then a battery and electrical wire. And some of these things you might have had from some of your previous main lessons. There were some things that we had from our physics main lesson block, but for the most part, we needed a lot of new materials for this particular main lesson block. Something that I really liked that was mentioned at the beginning of this book was the difference in the physics main lesson block compared to the chemistry main lesson block. And this was a really nice reminder of how students may be relating to the material or the demonstrations for physics versus for chemistry. Now for physics, we're starting our physics main lesson blocks in grade 6. We have them again in grade 7 and possibly in grade 8. Now this book does have them for all 3 grades. Our curriculum that we use by Live Education has 2 main lesson blocks for physics. You can start them in 6th grade, or you can start them in 7th grade and do 7th, 8th grade, or you can do 6th and 7th grade. We're starting the physics before the chemistry. Physics is something that's very observable. You're looking at forces and they reveal themselves through their results. And so they're easy to see. And this book reminds us that they're also oftentimes reversible, and you can also pause the demonstration midway, whereas with chemistry, you can't pause. Once a chemical reaction has started, it needs to go to completion. And the causes and the effects and the results are sometimes less apparent. Oftentimes, they're quite a mystery. And when it comes to figuring those things out, you're utilizing a lot more of your feelings versus your observation, because when it comes to physics, you're relying on your senses to see what's going on. When it comes to chemistry, you can see something happen, but you can't rely on your senses to know why that happened or what actually was going on with that chemical reaction. So it's a really great opportunity to have those illustrations be quite magnificent, because those demonstrations are going to lend themselves to those kinds of illustrations. It also says that the 7th grade student tends to be more familiar with physical force, but in 8th grade, the opposite is true. So in 7th grade, they're more familiar with the physical forces, but in 8th grade, they are more familiar with the chemistry of foodstuff, and they know less about fluid mechanics and aeromechanics. So this is a great opportunity to meet the student where they already have that general experience, and then work with that interest or experience with these different main lesson blocks. There's one more resource that's very specifically Waldorf, and this is a new resource for us, so I don't know very much about it yet. This is chemistry in classes 7 and 8 for class teachers of Steiner and Waldorf schools. So this is really for the classroom teacher, not for the homeschooler, but I did want to get it because sometimes I find great wisdom and examples when I'm looking at material that's intended for the classroom teacher. Not necessarily going to do this exactly this way, but it does provide me some insight. When I first started homeschooling, I didn't know very much about how to do our main lesson in the sense of the opening activities, the review, and how long the duration was. And so those insights came about quite by accident, actually, but it was something that's so basic, and for me, it seemed like it was overlooked because it seemed so obvious. And so by reading a book that's geared specifically to teachers in a classroom, I might gain some wisdom that might be so simple and so obvious for the classroom teacher, but is something that's brand new for me as a homeschooler and a homeschool teacher. So some things are going to be very different for the homeschooler when it comes to doing labs, because you're primarily just working with your one student, versus in a school setting, usually people partner up, and there are usually two people doing a lab. There may be more, but in my experience, it's usually two people doing a lab, and you're not really going to have that same interaction in a homeschool setting unless you decide to have more students, or you have some of your other students within your homeschool, maybe they're close in age, doing the labs together. So this is going to go through some of the same topic areas. My understanding is that a lot of the chemistry main lesson blocks are based on a single teacher who worked in the original Waldorf school back in the 1920s. And a lot of the wisdom that comes from the lessons and how they are put together comes from that one teacher. And certainly there have been some refinements over the years and teachers finding ways to do things. But for the most part, a lot of the basic structure comes from that first teacher and the notes or the wisdoms garnered from those experiences. So you have class 7 chemistry, class 8 chemistry, class 7 experiments, and class 8 experiments. And so you're going to find that this book includes the experiments as well. And then it includes the chemistry for both of these grades, which is wonderful. And having not used this yet, I can just tell you that I'm sure that it's packed with great wisdom and great information. As far as being user-friendly, I still cannot speak highly enough about chemistry the Waldorf way. It is just so user-friendly. I love the format that it's really hard for me to find something that's going to surpass it. But here is another option. If you're looking for something that's geared for Waldorf teachers, this might be a really good option for you to get your experiments down and to get the information you need in order to present your lessons. I have one other new resource that I want to share with you, and then one resource for the teacher. Chemistry Around Us is a poetry book by Elizabeth Woods. And the reason why I got this is, number one, I had not seen any other chemistry poetry books, so I thought we could use this for our opening activities. Now that I'm looking through it, I'm a little bit less impressed with the content. The illustrations still, for many of the illustrations, are still pretty enjoyable for me. Let's take the poem on scents. Perfume and scents of fragrance so fine, chemical compounds, a sensory shrine, from flowers to fruits to herbs and more, chemical reactions, a scent to adore. So it's pleasant, but it's maybe not quite what I would want to use on a daily basis for our chemistry unit, especially for our opening activities. But I love the innovation, and I love that there's something like this out there for a chemistry unit, because often we're not looking at chemistry from an artistic perspective, even though when you start to do the labs, there's some really beautiful reactions and colors that can come about from your experiments and from your demonstrations. But we're not really thinking about chemistry as an opportunity for other kinds of artistic expression, either poetry or music. But when you find that, I love the creativity behind it. So if you're looking for something like this might be a good option. I wasn't as thrilled with this resource, but I do appreciate the effort tremendously, and I do like some of the illustrations quite a bit. I do have a number of resources that can help the teacher or the parent get familiar with chemistry, but they don't all fall in line with the Waldorf approach. And by that is that I have a lot of books on, say, the periodic table or the elements or or compounds, or a kit where you can build your own compounds. But those are not necessarily the topics of discussion for the Waldorf approach for chemistry. So one thing that you might do in order to get the proper resource books is to look at the different topics that are going to be covered in your Waldorf Main Lesson Block. Here we can see that combustion is the first topic, and it's also the first topic in the other two resources that I have: salt forming process, and then solution, solvents, and catalysts. What I would do, and what I have done, is to look for resources that talk about combustion. And I didn't find a single book yet on that, but I've only just looked at the books that we currently have for our sciences. And so a book like this, the DK Eyewitness books, these ones I have really mixed feelings about. Sometimes I find them to be of tremendous value. Other times I find them not to work so well with the way that we want to use our books. Typically I use these to read aloud as part of our opening activities. This book is not read aloud material at all. It does have a nice paragraph on each 2-page spread, which is one topic area. So if you just wanted a little bit of information on that one topic area, this would be great. It also has a lot of pictures. Or photographs, I should say. I tend to like illustrations more than photographs, but I really appreciate having a resource that has the photographs in them. And so sometimes I will sit with my students, I'll read this portion aloud, and then I'll ask them to choose any of the illustrations they are interested, or any of the photographs they're interested in, and then I'll read those captions. But it's not really something that you read caption by caption all the way through, turn the page and continue reading. It doesn't read that well. This is a great, very quick resource with limited information on these different topic areas that you could use. And so that's why I am presenting this book as a resource, but it's certainly not the best option. I just encourage you to find a single or a couple of resources that can help you, maybe something more similar to an encyclopedia that's going to be robust in its information and broad in its topics. So I did find that there was an entry on combustion. I think it was page 30 and 31. Here we go. And so this would be something that you could use as a teacher to familiarize yourself with some of these concepts before presenting the lesson. But I feel like this isn't going to be enough to really provide enough information for the lesson. And I feel like you will need another resource as well. This book also has an entry on acids and bases, chemical reactions. So this might be a simple resource that could give you an overview of some of these topics, but I also have the Science Encyclopedia, but this is going to go over so many different topic areas that there might be the same amount of information that you can get out of a thick book like this. But if you plan to use it for different topic areas in physics, biology, earth science, astronomy, and chemistry, then this might be a good resource for you. I find that books like this are great to remind yourself about something that you can just, I'm going to flip to that page and read up on it. But also with the internet, it's really easy just to do a quick search on some of the things that you're like, I remember those laws for motion, but I can't remember exactly what they are. I find myself more quickly going to the internet to confirm some of those things rather than pulling from my books, which I used to do a lot more frequently. So this might be a good resource for you just to have and get practiced at referring to it. But if you need something specifically for chemistry, more as a resource than a read aloud, then the Chemistry by DK Eyewitness might be a good resource for you. The last thing I want to share with you are the main lesson books that we are using. So while one of the recommendations was to use books that are 11 inches by 14 inches, so this is 9.5 inches by 9.5 by 12 inches. So a little bit bigger this way, a little bit bigger this way would be the advice for the chemistry book. But this is the one that we have used in the past. This is my son's work but there aren't that many entries. But these pages have double-sided blank pages separated by an onion skin so that whatever illustration you're doing doesn't transfer to your written work, or any pencil marks don't transfer to your illustrations. So it does come with an onion skin, but the pages are not lined. And my children prefer lined pages, so they will draw in their own lines instead of just doing the instead of just writing. And then in this case, my son had so much writing that he did 2 pages of written lines, and then the illustration would have been on a different page, and then he moved on to another biography here. So, and this is we never completed this main lesson block, and he's since graduated from our homeschool, so we're definitely not going to go back to this. But moving forward, I still plan to use this format for our main lesson work, and I still really like these main lesson books. They are from A Child's Dream. They are maybe $6 a piece, and they come with several pages. Often they have more pages than we need for our main lesson, and I really, for the main lesson block, and I really try to finish out the book if possible, rather than having a lot of books that are half used and then they're just being stored with empty pages. This isn't the only way you could do this. You could do individual sheets that you bound at the end of the unit, and I know that Waldorf schools tend to do that as well. When I went to my Waldorf school when I was very young, many years ago, we did have main lesson books, and we did do our entries directly into the main lesson books. And if you made a really big error, which I remember doing that one time, the teacher pasted a new sheet of paper right over the page in the main lesson book so that you could just correct it and do the new illustration or written portion or whatever it was that couldn't be erased. You could just do it right over on that sheet of paper. And some schools, they will just take sheets of paper, and then once the entire main lesson block is done, then you combine that entire main lesson book into one book. And then yet other people might just have one main lesson book for what they're working on currently, and it could include maybe some math lessons, and then they move on to some chemistry lessons, and then on to some history lessons, and it's all contained in that one book. So the child might have 2 or 3 main lesson books for that entire year, and all of the work is enclosed in those 3 books. So that is a few different ways that you could approach using a main lesson book. And I do encourage you to use some of the larger sizes that maybe you're not used to using, especially when the kids are young. It's highly advisable to use the large sheets of paper when the kids are young. But even as they get older and you move into smaller notebooks, I still found that I preferred the larger notebooks. The kids didn't. The students preferred the smaller ones because it was less intimidating and they had the line pages on the smaller ones, but I still preferred the larger ones. And so we do have a mix in our homeschool, but whenever possible, for some of the lessons, I do prefer the larger format. I think that's everything. I hope that you enjoyed this look at the materials that we're using for our chemistry main lesson block. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information, as well as links to all of the resources that you see here today. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.